Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Yoma Daf Samach Gimel discusses the sugya of shchutei chutz, shechting a carbon that's supposed to be brought inside the Beis Hamikdash, inside the Azara, shechting that outside the Azara. The Gemara has two discussions about that. Number one is, when do we see a concept of a hoil as far as that's concerned? We'll explain that. And number two, how does that apply to the goat, the soyer la'azazel that's meant to be pushed off the cliff? So first of all, an introduction to the concept of shchutei chutz. The Torah says that if you shecht any carbon outside of the Azara, it is violating an issur called shchutei chutz, and one gets kares for that. Now, that only applies if the carbon is ready to be brought, if the animal is ready to be brought as a carbon inside the Beis Hamikdash. If it couldn't be brought inside the Beis Hamikdash, one does not violate the issur for that. Now, the Gemara will first discuss the concept of hoel. Hoel says as follows: although the carbon that this animal was set aside for, it can't be brought, it's not ready for that. Hoel says, since it could be brought as a different carbon, or possibly in modified circumstances, therefore one does violate the issur. That means to say as follows: if we have an animal that's set aside for a certain carbon, and that carbon it could not be brought at, but it could be brought as a different carbon, so then by shechting it as a carbon outside the Beis Hamikdash, I do violate the issur. That's the concept of hoel. So the Gemara wants to explore how far this concept goes and to what extent we bring it. And the Gemara will have three different levels of when we say hoel, when we do not say hoel. So we'll have three cases which are relevant. Let's discuss the case of the carbon Pesach. A carbon Pesach is meant to be brought as a carbon Pesach, of course, during the time of the Chiyuv carbon Pesach, which is after Concise and Erev Yom Kippur. Perhaps which is after Concise and Erev Pesach, of course, perhaps for the length of Pesach itself. Once that time is over, it can't be brought as a carbon Pesach anymore. It's puzzle. It's the wrong time to be a carbon Pesach. However, it could be brought as a carbon shlamim. You may, though, have to do a procedure to change it. You may have to do an akira. You may have to change it from being a carbon Pesach to being a carbon shlamim. So the Gemara has three different versions of what the halacha is if somebody shechts a carbon Pesach, an animal set aside as a carbon Pesach. If somebody shechts it bachutz, outside of the Azara, is he violating shchutei chutz or not? So the three cases are: does he do it as a carbon Pesach? He does it l'shem Pesach, which it's puzzle for now, or does he do it l'shem shlamim, which it's kosher for now, or does he do it stam, without identifying which one it is? And there are three versions of what this halacha is. So the Gemara says, according to Rav Dimi quoting Rabbi Yirmiyah quoting Rabbi Yochanan, and according to Rabbi Yirmiyah Midifti, the halacha is no matter how you do it, he's putter. He doesn't violate anything. Why? Because if he brings it as a carbon Pesach, it's not ready to be brought as a carbon Pesach. This is not the time. If he brings it as a carbon shlamim, it's not a carbon shlamim. In order to make it into a carbon shlamim, you have to change it from a Pesach to a shlamim, and you can only change it from a Pesach to a shlamim by going into the Beis Hamikdash and getting ready to shecht it and shechting it as a carbon shlamim. If you're outside the Beis Hamikdash the whole time, it doesn't count as changing it. Therefore, it was never any carbon. You brought it as a carbon, whether you brought it as a Pesach or as a shlamim, you shechted it outside the Azara, you never brought it as something that it was fitting for, and therefore you didn't violate the issur of shchutei chutz. That's what they hold. Now, according to Ravin quoting Rav Yirmiyah quoting Rabbi Yochanan, and according to Rav Ashi, the opposite is true. Whether you brought it as a carbon Pesach or you brought it as a carbon shlamim, you violated shchutei chutz either way if you shechted it outside the Azara. What's the reason? So if you brought it as a carbon shlamim, so for sure, it's ready to be brought inside as a carbon shlamim. You could take this animal. You could do an akira outside. You could change it from a pesach to a shlamim outside the Beis Hamikdash. Not a problem. And you could bring it as a carbon shlamim. So if you shecht it as a carbon shlamim outside the Azara, for sure you violated an issur of shchutei chutz. Even if you shecht it as a carbon Pesach, you violate it anyway. Why? It can't be brought as a carbon Pesach now. That's true. But we say hoel. We say since this animal could be brought as a shlamim, you're bringing a fitting carbon. It just has to be made into a shlamim. And you're doing it, you're taking this animal and shechting it as a carbon outside the Azara. You're doing it as a Pesach, fine, but it was a kosher as a shlamim, and therefore Hoel says you violate the issur of shchutei chutz anyway. That's what they hold. Now we have a different quote from Rav Chizda, who says, if you bring it, and there's a different version that this is Rabbah, if you bring it, and the Gemara also adds that Rav Chilkiah Bar Tovi says a similar halacha in a different case, which we'll see. But if you bring it as a carbon Pesach, so you didn't violate any Yisr. It's possible as a carbon Pesach. If you bring it as a carbon Shlamim, you did violate the Yisr. That's because you're doing an Akira, and an Akira works even outside the base of English. You could change it from a Pesach to a Shlamim. What if you bring it without saying? So Rav Chisda doesn't say. So the Gemara assumes that the implication is if you bring it without saying, we assume that it stays what it was before, which is a korban Pesach, and therefore you did not violate anything. Now the Gemara has a question here, though. According to Rav Chisda, we know that he does hold of the concept of Hoel. We saw that Rav Chisda says about the Soyer on Yom Kippur, which is you have to do the Geirel, you have to draw lots before you could use it for anything. Rav Chisda says if you do it Shchutei Chutz before you draw lots, if you do violate an Isser, and you do violate Shchutei Chutz, and the reason is because you could have used it as the Korban Musaf for Yom Kippur. But it wasn't meant to be Korban Musaf, and you didn't bring it as a Korban Musaf. But since we say Hoel, and it could be used as a Korban Musaf, therefore you do violate. So the Gemara says, well, why don't you say Hoel or also? Why don't you say Hoel, you could have brought this Korban Pesach as a Korban Shlamim, you violate the Isser. So the Gemara says, because it's different here, because you have to do an Akira, and he didn't do an Akira. If he actually goes and he does an Akira and he makes it as a Shlamim, then he does violate the Isser, because he could have brought it inside as a Shlamim, instead he brought it outside as a Shlamim. But if he doesn't actually do an Akira, you don't say Hoa. You only say Hoa when it's ready to be brought now as what it is. This animal is designated as a Pesach, it stays a Pesach until you change it. By Yom Kippur, Sayer, we're talking about where it was never designated as anything. So you could have brought it as a Korban Musaf Yom Kippur, just like you could have brought it as a Korban Chatos Lashem Bifnim. And that's why Rav Chisda would say over here, in the case of the Korban Pesach, where you didn't change it, you don't violate Shchutei Chutz, but in Kippur you do violate Shchutei Chutz. Now the Gemara points out that Rav Chilkiah Bar Tovi says a similar halacha, but he's talking about something else. He's talking about a Zav, Zava, Yoledis, Metzera, or Nazir. They have to bring, depending on who they are, when they have to bring a Korban Chatas, or an Asham, or a Shlamim. So if they bring their Korban Chatas in the wrong time, that means they're obligated to bring this carbon as part of their purification. But if they bring it before their time is up, Yoledis before it's 8 days after the birth, Zav before he finishes his Yemei Nikia, each one in its proper time. If they do it in the wrong time, so if they're brought as an asham or a chatas or whatever it is that needs to be in the right time, and there's no way to bring it in the wrong time, so they're pater. This is talking about, of course, where they brought it as shchutei chutz. So they're pater because they could not have brought it inside. It wasn't ready. If, however, they bring it as a carbon oil or carbon shlamim, which anybody's allowed to bring any animal as the oil and a shlamim, whatever you want, you could always volunteer an oil or a shlamim, so then they do violate the Yisr. So the Gemara says, Chilkiah Bar Tovi says that that's the way it is. If his comment on a Mishnah is where the Mishnah says that you violate the Yisr as where you brought it as a shlamim or an oila, you don't violate shchutei chutz, so you bring it as the carbon that you're supposed to bring when your time is up, and the time is not up yet. The Gemara points out that he doesn't say hoel here, because why don't you say that when you bring it as the wrong carbon, you could have brought it as a oil or as a shlamim, so you say hoel, I could have brought it as a shlamim, I'm violating it even if I bring it as something else. He doesn't say hoel. And again, the reason is because you have to do an akira, and you didn't do an akira, you have to change it from the carbon that it is to the carbon that it could be, and it's already designated as the zav, the yoledis is a carbon, whatever it is, and they didn't change the designation, therefore you don't say ho. But if they would change the designation, then you would say ho, and they would violate the iser of shchutei chutz. The Gemara now moves on to its next related discussion, which is that we've been assuming all along that the iser of shchutei chutz does not apply to the goat which goes la'azazel. That is, if you take the goat which is meant to go la'azazel, meant to be pushed off the cliff, there's no iser of shchutei chutz on that. You shech that as a carbon outside the base of English, you don't violate shchutei chutz. The Gemara wants to know how that's true. The Gemara will have some questions and answers on that, and then the Gemara will discuss whether the Sa'ir la'azazel has the iser of mechusar zman if you shechted when it's not a time that it's allowed to be shechted. So first of all, that there's no Isser of shchutei chutz on the Sa'ir la'azazel. Let's look at the pasuk that describes the Isser of shchutei chutz and the brisa which explains it word by word. So the pasuk says as follows: Somebody shechts a ox, a sheep, or a goat in the camp, or outside the goat, or outside the camp. He did not bring it to the door of the Oyel Moed. Lahakar carbon Hashem, and he did not bring it to the door of the Oyel Moed to bring as a carbon to Hashem. Lifnei Mishkan Hashem, Dami Chashav Lai, that's blood. Hu Dami Shafach, he spilled blood. V'nichas Yeshu Mikarav Amai, he gets kares for that. So the Gemara says as follows. This is describing that he did a shchutei chutz. So it says, it refers to it as a carbon. He should have brought it as a carbon, and he did not. That means we're talking about an animal which was supposed to be a carbon. Well, the Gemara says that's a very general term. The word carbon applies to anything that has kedusha, even kedushas damim. Even if it was just brought for bedek habayis, it was not donated to be a carbon at all. It was donated to be used by the Beis Hamikdash to cover its expenses. Its value was given. How do we know that? Because we have a pasuk that's clearly talking about value, and it calls it a carbon. It says v'nakrev is carbon Hashem. All these things are not given as karbanos, they don't go on the mizbeach at all. It's still called carbon. So the fact that it wasn't brought as a carbon, I would see from, if we just use the word carbon, I would say that even a bedek habayis kedusha that is slaughtered outside the Beis Hamikdash violates shchutei chutz. But the pasuk minimizes it more when it says al pesach oyel moed lo hiviyah. It's something that he violated because he didn't bring it to the door of the oyel moed. So now we see it has to be something that's brought to the door of the oyel moed. That excludes bedek habayis, but it still could include the soyer lazazel, because that is brought to the oyel moed. It is brought into the Azara to do the drawing of lots, to do the gairo. According to different gersayos, it could also refer to the para aduma. Here Rashi takes that gersa out. Now the Gemara then says that we do eliminate soyer lazazel from this discussion, and that's because it says lahashem. It says lahakriv carbon lahashem. Azazel doesn't go Lashem. It doesn't go as a carbon Lashem. It gets pushed off a cliff. Azazel, that's not called Lashem. Therefore, that's excluded from this entire Isser of Shchutei Chutz. The Gemara now asks, the word Lashem here is used as an exclusionary phrase. It's excluding Soyer HaMishtalech, the Soyer Azazel, that is not part of the Isser of Shchutei Chutz. But I'll show you something else where it's used as an inclusion, to include the Soyer Azazel in a certain halacha. Which halacha is that? The halacha of Mechusar Zman, wrong time. Now, there's different ways that an animal could be wrong time. The main pasuk that we're focusing on here is talking about where an animal's too young. It's got to be at least 8 days old before you can bring it as a carbon. The Gemara shows that the word Lashem includes that it also applies to Lazazel. The Lazazel animal also has the halacha that has to be at least 8 days old. Where do you see that? So the pasuk describing the proper age says, "Sharei chasav ha'ez ki yivaled," ox, sheep, or a goat when it's born. For 7 days it's with its mother. From 8th day and on, you could bring it as a carbon. So the Gemara says again, carbon could be anything. Isha means something which goes on the fire. Any carbon which is burned, it goes on the fire. How do you know that it applies to a Sar HaMishtalech? We have an extra Lashem to include even a Sar HaMishtalech. Gemara says, well, what is it then? Lashem is including Sar HaMishtalech or it's excluding Sar HaMishtalech? So Gemara says it depends on context. If without the word Lashem you would have included it, so the extra word Lashem is telling you different than what you thought before. You would have included it, now it's excluded. That's what we say by Shchutei Chutz. However, if without it you would have excluded it, so the extra word Lashem is to include it, and that's what we say by Mechusar Zman. So now the Gemara has a kasha over here. You're telling me that without the pasuk, I would have thought that the Sar Lazazel could be too young. It could be something which is not ready to be brought as a carbon. It could be brought as a Sar Lazazel. The Gemara says, how could that be? You have to, the way the Sar Mishtalech, the goat Lazazel, is identified is by bringing 2 goats. One goes to the carbon chatas Lashem, and one goes Lazazel. That means both have to be ready to go. So that means that this goat that you're bringing as a Mechusar Zman, you can't possibly bring that one as the chatas Lashem. We know that if you're bringing a goat to be that will become Azazel, it's got to be befitting to, if the girl falls on it, to be the carbon chatas. But if you're bringing one that's too young, it can't be a carbon chatas. So how could it then end up ever being set as a carbon lazazel, as a soyer lazazel? So the Gemara says obviously there has to be a way that it could be identified and labeled and set aside to be lazazel without going through the drawing of lots, that it could have ended up being a carbon lashem, the chatas lashem. So what's that way? So the Gemara has to try 3 or 4 approaches to this. The Gemara, first of all, wants to say what happened is that the Gairul was performed on 2 other Seirim, 2 other goats, and one of them got lost. And then I bring this one as a replacement. So this one replaces that one, and therefore you don't need the Gairul. So Gemara says, who holds that that's how you do it? Gemara says, Chanana Mitzri. Chanana Mitzri says that even if you have the carbon chatas goat was already shechted, and all that's left of it is that it's a cup of blood, you still just bring another animal to put along with it. So you bring another sire to be the Azazel as the pair for this cup of blood, which is what's left of the chatas. So Gemara says, Chanana Mitzri never said that you don't have to do a gairul. He just said that you don't have to bring a new sire as the chatas. He said that the fact that you lost Azazel doesn't mean that the chatas carbon is ruined. That cup of blood is still good. But maybe I do have to do a gairul. Maybe I have to bring 2 goats. I have to do a gairul. And when I figure out which one of these 2 is La Hashem, that one goes to graze until it gets a mum, because I can't use it, because I have my cup of blood already that I'm still using. And the one that becomes Azazel is the replacement for the Azazel that I lost. But you don't see that he says that there's no gairul. You just see that he says that I don't have to get rid of the Azazel chatas that I did already. So the Gemara says, you're right, it's not him, it's Rabbi Shimon. Because Rabbi Shimon says clearly that if one of them dies, you bring another replacement for it without doing a gairul. You don't have to do a gairul again. Okay, now the Gemara says the third choice here. Ravina says, we're talking about a case where the Sar Azazel wasn't lost, but the original Sar Azazel got a mum. So you have to replace it. So you replace it with another Sar Azazel. On this one time you don't have to do a gairul because you just take the kedusha of the Sar Azazel and you move it on to this one because that one got a mum. So Gemara says, well, hold on a second, interrupting the train of thought over here. How do you know that the concept of a mum applies to a Sar Azazel? Who said that there's an Isser mum on a Sar Azazel at all? That you're saying that it got a mum, I have to replace it. So the Gemara goes into the psukim of mumin, and over there it says, you cannot bring any of these mumin as a carbon to Hashem, and you can't put fire, you can't put it on the fire, mehem from them on the mizbeach. So the Brisa defines this. So it says, what do I learn from this? So the word isha tells me it can't go on the fire. Can't go on the mizbeach. Mayhem from them tells me not even a concise of them can go on the fire. The word mizbeach, that tells me that I can't even put the blood on the mizbeach from them. And the word Lashem again, that is to include soya mishtaleach, that the goat that goes Azazel has the same psul of a mum. So now the Gemara points out, so you have a separate pasuk telling me that the psul of mechusar zman, the psul of wrong time, applies to Sar Azazel, and you have a separate pasuk telling me that the psul of having a mum applies to the Sar Azazel. Why do you need both of them? Gemara says you need them both. If you only told me mechusar zman, so mechusar zman, I would not know that if I only knew that mechusar zman was a psul, I would not know that a mum was a psul, because mechusar zman was never ever fitting. In the state where he was born and he didn't become old enough yet to be a proper carbon, he was never ready to be a carbon. So I wouldn't have no reason to assume that he's ready to be, that I could use him as a carbon. However, a Sar Mishtalech, which was ready, and then he got a mum, maybe he stays ready. Maybe the mum doesn't take off his readiness factor. Meaning maybe Mechusar Zman is something that he never had a readiness factor. But if he had a mum and he was ready at some point, so getting a mum would not make him puzzle for it. And the other way, if I only had the pasuk that told me that if he has a mum, he's no good, that the psul of mum applies to a Sar Azazel, maybe that's because the psul of mum is disgusting. A mum is considered disgusting with Hashem. But Mechusar Zman, he's just not old enough, maybe that doesn't apply. So now the Gemara continues its list of the ways that you could possibly have a Sar Azazel become, you could have a goat become the Sar Azazel without having to go through the gairul procedure. The Gemara brings its final answer. This is from Rava. The Gemara says that we're not talking about where it was Mechusar Zman because he was too young. We're talking about where he was Mechusar Zman for a different reason. Remember, the question was, how could you ever have a Sar Azazel via Mechusar Zman if he could never be brought? If he didn't have a possibility of becoming the chatos lifnim, then he can never be part of the gairul to be a mechusar zman. So the Gemara says, no, we're talking about a case to be a Sar Azazel. So the Gemara says, no, we're talking about a case where he went through the gairul process. and he was at that time not a mechusar zman. He was fine. He could have become the carbon chatas or the azazel, and he became the azazel through the gairo process. Later he became a mechusar zman. How's that? Because he's not mechusar zman because he's too young. He's a mechusar zman because he's a oisev es benai. His mother was slaughtered that day, and the halacha is you cannot slaughter as a carbon an animal on the same day that its mother was slaughtered. The Gemara says his mother was slaughtered that day. It's Yom Kippur. How is his mother slaughtered on Yom Kippur? The Gemara says somebody was sick, somebody was a chayla, sakanas nefashis. You shachted an animal for him. That happens to be this Sarah's mother. Now you can't bring him. He's a mechusar zman until the end of the day. So Gemara. So for that we needed a pasuk because he's no problem of him not being able to be a possible carbon bifnim, chatas bifnim, because he already went through the gairo. Now he became a mechusar zman. So the Gemara says, well, how do you know that the iser of oisev es benoi, of not shachting an animal on the day that its mother was shachted, how do you know that applies to pushing it off a cliff, la zazel? That's not a shchita. So the Gemara says, yeah, because the Talmidim have said in Marava, pushing him off the cliff is counted like his.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.